The autumn air of 1589 carried an unusual chill through the streets of Cologne. Peter Stumpp stood bound to the massive wooden wheel, its spokes casting long shadows across the execution ground. The crowd had gathered early, their murmurs creating an ominous backdrop to what was about to unfold. Stump's eyes darted between the executioner's tools laid out with methodical precision, red-hot pincers glowing like fallen stars, the heavy iron implements that would soon reshape his very existence. The great wheel itself loomed behind him, a monument to centuries of calculated suffering. He could hear his own breathing, rapid and shallow. The executioner stepped forward, and the crowd fell silent. This wasn't just another execution. This was a ritual that had claimed thousands across Europe, a practice so systematically brutal that it had earned a saint's name while delivering anything but salvation. The first tool was lifted. Stump's world was about to become a masterclass in methodical agony, each stage carefully orchestrated by a legal system that believed in making punishment mirror the crime, and then amplifying it beyond all reason. But this moment, this terrible culmination, doesn't begin here. To understand how Peter Stumpp found himself facing this medieval nightmare, we must journey back through centuries of human cruelty. The scene is set. A man faces an unimaginable end. But this wasn't an isolated nightmare. This was a system. How did humanity devise such a monstrous ritual? And how did this particular man, accused of impossible crimes, find himself at the mercy of this barbaric machine? Imagine, it's 1841, the age of steam, of burgeoning industry, of scientific enlightenment. Yet in Prussia, a man named Rudolf Künapfel faces a terror that belongs to the darkest chapters of medieval history, the breaking wheel. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Witnesses later whispered that Künapfel never actually faced the wheel's full fury. At the last moment, perhaps moved by the changing times or simple human mercy, the executioner may have strangled him first. A final act of compassion before the ancient ritual played out for the crowd's expectation. This moment represents something profound, the slow, reluctant death of a punishment that had terrorized Europe for over a millennium. The breaking wheel, known by many names but unified in its purpose, was finally becoming too barbaric even for societies that had embraced it for centuries. Now, here's what makes this timeline so remarkable. By the time Künapfel faced his fate, Bavaria had already officially outlawed the practice in 1813. The winds of change were blowing across Europe, carrying with them new ideas about justice, human dignity, and the proper role of the state in punishment. But the wheel's roots ran deep, incredibly deep. Ancient Greeks had used similar devices for torture and execution, understanding the psychological impact of prolonged public suffering. The Romans had refined these methods, and medieval Europe had embraced them with an enthusiasm that spoke to something dark in the human spirit. The breaking wheel wasn't just about ending a life, it was about making a statement. The condemned would be tied to the great wooden wheel, their limbs positioned for maximum impact. Heavy iron bars would systematically shatter bones, the number of blows often predetermined by the court. This wasn't random violence, it was bureaucratic cruelty, methodical and documented. And the aftermath was perhaps even more chilling. The broken body would often be threaded through the spokes of another wheel and hoisted high on a pole, displayed for days or weeks. Left to die slowly from injuries, exposure, and the attention of carrion birds. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who transgress against society. What's truly unsettling is how long this practice endured. We're talking about a punishment that survived the fall of Rome, the rise of Christianity, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. It persisted through massive social changes, technological advances, and shifting philosophical views about human nature and justice. The wheel's popularity peaked during the late Middle Ages, a time when public executions served multiple purposes. They were entertainment, certainly, but also practical demonstrations of state power. The breaking wheel was particularly effective because it combined maximum suffering with maximum spectacle. Different regions developed their own variations, their own improvements to the basic design. Some wheels featured metal rims or protruding iron blades. Others incorporated additional elements, sharp wooden stakes beneath the victim, fires for burning, creative positioning that maximized both pain and visibility for the crowd. The truly haunting aspect is how normalized this became. Families would bring children to watch. Vendors sold food and drink. The longer a victim survived on the wheel, the more successful the execution was considered by some spectators. Human suffering had become a form of public entertainment, sanctioned by both church and state. But by the 19th century, something fundamental was shifting. The same societies that had once cheered at public breakings were beginning to question not just the methods, but the entire philosophy behind such punishments. The ideas of reformers, philosophers, and humanitarians were taking root. Bavaria's 1813 ban wasn't an isolated incident. Across Europe, rulers and legislators were quietly retiring instruments of torture that had once been considered essential tools of justice. The breaking wheel, along with devices like the rack and the Iron Maiden, was becoming an embarrassment, a reminder of a more brutal past that progressive societies wanted to leave behind. The whispered mercy shown to Rudolf Kühnapfel in 1841 represents this transition perfectly. Even when the old forms were maintained for tradition or legal requirement, there was often a growing reluctance to carry them out in their full, traditional horror. Yet the wheel's story doesn't end with its European decline. Even as civilized nations abandoned the practice, the instrument of terror was finding new life in unexpected places, serving different masters with equally dark purposes. New York City, 1712, not the bustling metropolis we know today, but a colonial outpost gripped by fear and racial tension. For enslaved people accused of disobedience or rebellion, a European instrument of torture had crossed the Atlantic, ready to make brutal examples that would echo through the communities for generations. The breaking wheel in colonial America served a different purpose than its European counterpart. This wasn't about elaborate legal procedures or religious concepts of justice. This was about control, pure and simple. The terror of the wheel was weaponized to maintain a system of human bondage that required constant intimidation to function. Here's what makes this global spread so chilling. The wheel wasn't just exported as a method, but as a symbol. Colonial administrators understood that the reputation of the device often preceded its actual use. The mere presence of a breaking wheel in a public square could serve as a constant reminder of the consequences of defiance. In the French territories of Louisiana during the 18th century, the breaking wheel appeared with disturbing regularity. French colonial law, influenced by European traditions, prescribed the wheel for various crimes, but its application was heavily skewed by the racial dynamics of slave society. What had been a universal punishment in Europe became a tool specifically designed to terrorize enslaved populations. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Enslaved communities would be forced to witness these executions, to see neighbors and family members subjected to prolonged, methodical torture. The message was unmistakable. This is the price of resistance. This is what happens when you forget your place in our social order. But the wheel's journey didn't stop in the Americas. On the Indian subcontinent, British colonial forces employed breaking wheels against Sikh communities during the 18th century. Here, the device took on additional religious and cultural dimensions, as colonial authorities used European methods to suppress what they saw as indigenous resistance to their rule. Now, here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. These colonial applications of the breaking wheel were often more arbitrary and brutal than their European predecessors. In Europe, there were at least formal legal procedures, prescribed numbers of blows, theoretical protections, and appeals processes. In the colonies, the wheel often operated with fewer restraints, fewer witnesses who mattered to the authorities, fewer voices raised in protest. The enslaved people facing the wheel in New York had no access to appeals courts or religious advocates. The Sikhs, subjected to breaking in India, couldn't petition European monarchs for mercy. The distance from metropolitan oversight allowed colonial administrators to employ the wheel with a freedom that would have been difficult to maintain in London or Paris. French Louisiana provides particularly well-documented examples of this colonial brutality. Multiple occasions of wheel executions were recorded throughout the 18th century, often for crimes that would have received lesser punishments in France itself. The colonial context created a kind of legal wilderness, where the most extreme punishments could be applied with relative impunity. What's truly haunting is how these colonial applications influenced the wheel's evolution. Techniques developed in the Americas or India sometimes made their way back to Europe, creating a kind of feedback loop of increasing brutality. Colonial experimentation with torture became a laboratory for refining methods of state violence. The enslaved communities of colonial America developed their own ways of coping with this terror. Spiritual practices, community support networks, and subtle forms of resistance helped people survive in a world where the breaking wheel loomed as a constant threat. But the psychological scars ran deep, affecting not just direct victims but entire communities forced to live under such brutal systems. In India, Sikh communities responded to wheel executions with their own forms of collective memory and resistance. Stories of those who died on the wheel became part of community histories, transformed from colonial terror into indigenous martyrdom. The British use of the wheel inadvertently created symbols of resistance rather than submission. The global spread of the breaking wheel reveals something important about how systems of violence propagate. It wasn't enough for European powers to develop these methods for their own populations. They felt compelled to export them, to use them as tools of colonial domination and racial control. This international dimension of the wheel's history often gets overlooked, but it's crucial for understanding the full scope of this instrument's impact. We're not just talking about medieval European history, we're talking about a tool of oppression that shaped communities across continents, leaving trauma that echoed through generations. But this global terror network of wheels and public suffering served another purpose that reveals something deeply troubling about human nature. They became a form of mass entertainment, drawing crowds who found excitement in others' agony. It wasn't just an execution, it was a festival of death. Picture this: vendors hawking their wares, children perched on their parents' shoulders for a better view, and crowds that could number in the thousands, all gathered for one purpose: to watch a human being die slowly, methodically, on the breaking wheel. And here's the most disturbing part. For many spectators, the longer the victim screamed and suffered, the better the entertainment value. A quick death was considered a disappointment. A prolonged ordeal was worth the price of admission. The case of a 14th century murderer illustrates this horrifying reality perfectly. Historical records show he survived on the wheel for 3 full days, his broken body displayed as he slowly succumbed to his injuries. The crowd didn't disperse after the first day, or even the second. They returned, day after day, to witness his gradual decline. But that pales in comparison to Bonadius, who reportedly endured 4 days and nights on the wheel. 4 days of exposure, pain, and the gradual failure of a body that had been systematically shattered. The fact that people continued to gather, to watch, to treat his suffering as a form of ongoing entertainment reveals something deeply troubling about the societies that embraced these spectacles. Now, here's where the story becomes almost unbelievable. There are accounts, some perhaps mythical but reflecting real attitudes, of victims surviving even longer. Christman Genepatenga, described as a serial killer from the 16th century, allegedly lasted 9 days on the wheel, and the truly chilling detail? Passers-by would offer him strong drinks, not to ease his suffering, but to keep him conscious and prolong the spectacle. Think about what this means. People would go out of their way to extend another human being's agony, treating prolonged torture as a form of community entertainment. They would invest time, money, and effort into maximizing suffering for their own amusement. These weren't isolated incidents or aberrant behavior by a few sadistic individuals. These were community events, often sanctioned by religious and civil authorities. Church officials would be present to provide spiritual commentary. Civic leaders would attend as honored guests. The breaking wheel execution was woven into the fabric of social life. The crowds that gathered weren't necessarily bloodthirsty monsters. They were ordinary people: merchants, farmers, craftsmen, mothers with children. The normalization of such extreme violence speaks to how societies can collectively embrace practices that would horrify individuals when considered in isolation. But here's what makes these spectacles even more psychologically complex. They served multiple social functions beyond entertainment. Public executions were meant to demonstrate the power of authority, to serve as warnings against criminal behavior, and to provide a sense of collective justice for the community. The breaking wheel was particularly effective for these purposes because it was so thoroughly, undeniably final. Unlike a hanging or beheading, which could be over in moments, the wheel provided hours or days of visible consequences. The message wasn't just, "this person is being punished." It was, This is what complete destruction looks like. Different communities developed their own traditions around wheel executions. Some had specific viewing areas for different social classes. Others incorporated religious ceremonies or civic speeches into the proceedings. The execution became a kind of social ritual, with established customs and expectations. The economics of these events were significant too. Innkeepers would see increased business. Food vendors could make substantial profits. Local craftsmen might sell souvenirs or commemorative items. The suffering of one person became an economic opportunity for many others. Children who attended these events would carry the memories for life. Imagine the psychological impact of watching a human being systematically destroyed while adults around you treated it as normal, even enjoyable. These experiences shaped entire generations' understanding of violence, justice, and human worth. The social pressure to attend could be enormous. Staying away might be seen as weakness, disloyalty to the community, or even sympathy for criminals. People who were naturally squeamish or compassionate often found themselves forced to participate in collective brutality simply to maintain their social standing. Some attendees undoubtedly experienced genuine horror and trauma from what they witnessed, but the social context made it difficult to express these feelings openly. The collective enthusiasm for suffering created an environment where individual conscience was suppressed in favor of group participation. The longer survival times weren't just accidents or results of the victim's natural resilience. They were often deliberately engineered through the choice of wheel design, the number and placement of blows, and even medical intervention to keep victims conscious longer. But this carefully orchestrated cruelty wasn't random sadism. It was rooted in a specific legal and spiritual philosophy that attempted to justify the unjustifiable. They called it Schauenspiegel, mirror punishment. The idea, enshrined in Holy Roman Empire law, was deceptively simple. The punishment should reflect the crime. A murderer who had taken life through violence should experience violence in return. But this mirror was more like a funhouse distortion, magnifying horror far beyond any reasonable proportion. The legal scholars who developed this concept weren't sadistic madmen scribbling in dark corners. They were respected jurists, often educated in the finest universities of their time, attempting to create a rational system of justice. The breaking wheel wasn't random cruelty, it was carefully reasoned brutality, which somehow makes it even more disturbing. Here's how the logic worked in practice. If someone committed murder by beating their victim, the breaking wheel provided a proportional response, death by systematic breaking of bones. But the proportionality was subjective, and the actual implementation often escalated far beyond anything that could be called equivalent. A single murder might result in dozens of bone-shattering blows on the wheel. The crime of taking one life could lead to days of public torture before death finally arrived. The mirror had become a magnifying glass, intensifying suffering beyond any reasonable interpretation of justice. But the legal justification was only half the story. The spiritual dimension of breaking wheel executions reveals an even darker aspect of medieval thought. Authorities believed they weren't just punishing the body, they were actively working to damn the soul. The practice of leaving broken bodies on display wasn't merely about deterrence. Religious authorities taught that if a body was left to be consumed by wild animals, the victim's soul would be prevented from finding eternal peace. This wasn't just execution, it was spiritual warfare, an attempt to extend punishment beyond death into eternity. Picture the theological implications. Civil authorities were claiming the power not just to end earthly life, but to influence the fate of immortal souls. The breaking wheel became a tool for playing God, for determining not just temporal punishment, but eternal destiny. The bodies left on display served as more than warnings to potential criminals. They were tangible reminders of the state's power over both physical and spiritual realms. Passers-by would see the remains and be reminded that authority extended beyond this world into the next. Now, here's where a sliver of hope enters this otherwise dark narrative. Very rarely, the wheel itself would break during an execution, or a victim would somehow become disengaged from the device. These incidents were immediately interpreted as divine intervention, God himself stepping in to spare the condemned. When this happened, it created enormous complications for the authorities. How do you argue with what appears to be a direct command from heaven? These rare occurrences often became local scandals or legends, with communities divided over whether to continue the execution or accept the apparent divine verdict. The legal systems had to develop procedures for handling these miracles. Some jurisdictions ruled that any malfunction of execution equipment was indeed divine intervention and required immediate commutation of the seized sentence. Others insisted on repairing or replacing the device and continuing with the punishment. These debates reveal the fundamental tension in the mirror punishment philosophy. If God was supposed to be the ultimate source of justice, what did it mean when divine intervention appeared to contradict human legal decisions? The breaking wheel forced medieval society to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between earthly and heavenly authority. The rarity of these incidents made them even more powerful in the popular imagination. Stories of broken wheels and divine rescue spread far beyond their original locations, becoming part of folklore and religious narrative. They offered hope to condemned prisoners and their families, however slim that hope might be. But for every story of divine intervention, there were thousands of cases where the wheel held firm and carried out its grim purpose. The vast majority of those sentenced to breaking died exactly as intended, slowly, publicly, and with their bodies left as warnings to others. The spiritual justifications for the breaking wheel also created interesting theological problems. If the punishment was meant to mirror divine justice, what did that say about the nature of God? Was the deity himself a torturer, a being who delighted in prolonged suffering? Different religious traditions struggled with these implications. Some clergy embraced the breaking wheel as an earthly representation of divine wrath. Others privately questioned whether such extreme methods could truly reflect a merciful God's will. These theological debates rarely influenced actual legal practice, but they created undercurrents of doubt within religious communities. The mirror punishment philosophy required authorities to carefully match specific tortures to specific crimes, leading to an elaborate categorization of suffering. But this systematic approach to pain required equally systematic tools, and the breaking wheel's genius lay in its brutal mechanical simplicity. Take a large wooden wagon wheel, the kind that might carry grain to market or transport a family across the countryside. Strong, sturdy, built to last. Now imagine it transformed into an instrument of methodical destruction, its humble purpose perverted into something that would haunt the nightmares of entire communities. The basic construction was deceptively simple, which made the breaking wheel both terrifying and practical. Most wheels were built from oak or other hardwood, with thick spokes radiating from a central hub. Some featured metal rims that added weight and durability. The most sinister variations included protruding iron blades or spikes, designed to maximize damage with each rotation. Here's where the mechanical genius becomes apparent and deeply disturbing. The wheel could be used in multiple ways, each designed for different types and durations of suffering. The most common method involved tying the victim's limbs to the wheel's rim, positioning them so that arms and legs were stretched across the spokes. The executioner would then use heavy iron hammers or bars to systematically strike the victim's limbs as the wheel slowly rotated. The number of blows wasn't left to chance, or the executioner's whim. It was predetermined by the court, written into the sentence like any other legal specification. 10 blows, 20, sometimes more, each one calculated to shatter bone without immediately causing death. But there was another method that was somehow even more brutal in its simplicity. Instead of striking the victim on the wheel, executioners would position a massive wheel high above the condemned person and drop it repeatedly. The full weight of the device would crash down, breaking bones through pure crushing force rather than precise strikes. The case of Johann Patkuhl in 18th century Sweden provides a horrifying example of how things could go wrong even within this systematized brutality. Patkuhl faced an unskilled executioner, a man whose incompetence turned an already horrific death into something almost unimaginably worse. Witness accounts record that the executioner delivered 15 or more blows instead of the prescribed number. Each strike was imprecise, causing maximum pain while failing to accomplish its intended purpose. Patkuhl's recorded cries, "Oh Jesus! Jesus, have mercy upon me!" and his desperate plea, "Cut off my head!" echo across the centuries as testimony to suffering that exceeded even the breaking wheel's normal standards. Father Lorenz Hagen, who witnessed Patkuhl's execution, left detailed accounts that reveal both the procedural nature of the punishment and the deeply human horror of watching it unfold. His descriptions capture the sounds, the timing, the methodical progression from living human being to broken form. Now, here's where the wheel's design revealed its most diabolic aspect. The execution often wasn't meant to end with the breaking itself. After the bones were systematically shattered, the victim's mangled body would be threaded through the spokes of another wheel, like some grotesque parody of weaving. This secondary wheel would then be hoisted on a tall pole and displayed in a public place. The victim, often still alive despite their injuries, would be left to die slowly from their wounds, exposure to the elements, and the attention of carrion birds. Death might come from blood loss, infection, dehydration, or simply from the cumulative trauma of having every major bone in their body deliberately destroyed. The positioning on the display wheel was itself a form of continued torture. The broken limbs would be woven through the spokes in ways that maintained the body's visibility while ensuring maximum discomfort for any remaining conscious moments. Every movement, every attempt to find a more comfortable position, would cause additional agony. The height of the display pole served multiple purposes. It made the victim visible from a distance, serving as a warning to anyone entering the community. It also placed the dying person beyond reach of family or friends who might attempt to provide comfort or hasten death out of mercy. Animals posed a constant threat to those displayed on the wheel. Ravens, crows, and other carrion birds would often begin feeding on the victim while they were still alive. At night, larger scavengers might attempt to reach the elevated body. The knowledge that this fate awaited would have been almost as torturous as the breaking itself. The entire process, from initial breaking to final death, could take days or even weeks. Some victims demonstrated remarkable resilience, clinging to life far longer than anyone expected. Others succumbed quickly to their injuries, though even quick death on the wheel usually meant hours rather than minutes. The mechanical precision of the wheel stood in stark contrast to the chaotic brutality of its effects. Every aspect was planned, measured, and documented, yet the result was pure, systematic destruction of human form and spirit. But human ingenuity and cruelty knew few bounds. The basic wheel was just the foundation. Creative minds would develop variations that pushed the boundaries of suffering even further. The Hamburg broadsheet from 1607 didn't mince words. It described a victim of a breaking wheel variation as being transformed into a huge screaming puppet, a sea monster of raw, slimy, and shapeless flesh. This wasn't metaphorical language. This was a contemporary observer, trying to find words for a horror that defied normal description. The basic breaking wheel was terrible enough, but human creativity and cruelty produced variations that pushed the boundaries of suffering into almost unimaginable territory. Some wheels featured sharp pieces of wood positioned beneath the victim, adding piercing wounds to the bone-shattering impacts above. Another variation involved tying victims in an X shape across the wheel and using iron rods to systematically crush bones rather than breaking them with hammers. The crushing method created different patterns of injury, different types of pain, different timeframes for death. Executioners became experts in these distinctions, developing professional pride in their ability to calibrate suffering. But perhaps the most horrific variation combined the breaking wheel with fire. Victims would be swung over open flames during or after the breaking process, adding burning to the catalogue of torments. The combination of broken bones, searing heat, and smoke inhalation created suffering that contemporary accounts struggled to document adequately. These variations weren't random experiments in sadism. They were developed for specific legal or practical purposes. Different crimes might call for different wheel methods. Some variations were designed to be more visible to crowds. Others were meant to prolong suffering for particular religious or deterrent purposes. Now, here's where the story takes an ironic turn that reveals something profound about human nature and historical memory. This instrument of systematic torture, this machine for breaking human bodies and spirits, took its most common name from a saint, Catherine of Alexandria. The irony cuts deep when you understand the legend. Saint Catherine, according to 4th century accounts that didn't appear in writing until the 9th century, was a brilliant young woman who converted to Christianity and challenged the Emperor Maxentius. Condemned to death on a spiked wheel, the legend tells us that the device miraculously shattered at her touch, sparing her the agony it was designed to inflict. Catherine was subsequently beheaded, dying a martyr's death, but avoiding the prolonged torture of the wheel. She became the patron saint of academics and scholars, protector of learning and wisdom. Most significantly for our story, she was also revered as the patron saint of those seeking protection from sudden, unexpected death. The profound irony here is almost too bitter to contemplate. A saint whose legend promised miraculous intervention, whose touch could shatter instruments of torture, whose patronage offered protection from unexpected death. This same saint lent her name to a device that delivered exactly the opposite: prolonged, expected, systematically administered death. Thousands of victims facing the Catherine wheel might have prayed to Saint Catherine herself for the same miracle that had allegedly saved her. They might have hoped for divine intervention, for the wheel to break, for merciful release from their ordained suffering. For the vast majority, such prayers went unanswered. The device's alternative names reveal different cultural attitudes toward its purpose. Breaking wheel was straightforward, descriptive, focused on function rather than heritage. But Catherine wheel carried religious connotations that complicated its meaning. Was this instrument blessed by association with a saint, or was it a mockery of divine mercy? The wheel's origins stretched back to ancient Greece, where similar devices had been used for torture and public execution. The Romans had their own versions. The practice had survived the fall of empires, the rise of Christianity, and countless changes in legal and social systems. By the late Middle Ages, it had reached peak popularity across Europe. Different regions developed their own traditions and techniques. German wheels often featured specific design elements that differed from French or English versions. Italian executioners developed their own professional standards. The breaking wheel became both universal and local, shared across cultures while adapting to regional preferences. The late Middle Ages saw the wheel's greatest proliferation, coinciding with a period of legal codification and systematic approach to criminal justice. The same impulse that created detailed legal codes and formal court procedures also refined and standardized methods of execution. The wheel became part of a bureaucracy of death. But the religious associations remained complicated. While St. Catherine's name graced the device, church officials often struggled with theological questions about state-sponsored torture. Some embraced the wheel as divine justice made manifest. Others quietly questioned whether such methods reflected Christian mercy and forgiveness. The transformation of St. Catherine's legend into an instrument of torture represents something larger about how societies process and sanitize violence. By connecting the wheel to a saint's name, communities could perhaps feel that their systematic brutality carried divine sanction. A saint whose legend promised miraculous intervention, a shattering wheel, a stark, cruel contrast to the fate awaiting so many others, including a man named Peter Stumpp, accused of being a werewolf, whose confession would lead him to face this very instrument of unholy martyrdom. Cologne, 1589. Terror had a name, and that name was Peter Stumpp. Whispers followed him through the streets, tales of a man who wasn't truly a man, who prowled the countryside at night wearing the form of a wolf, guided by powers that no Christian soul should possess. The accusations against Stumpp weren't merely criminal, they were supernatural, demonic, impossible. He was charged with being a werewolf, a cannibal, a murderer who had formed a pact with Satan himself. In an age where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was thin, such charges carried the weight of absolute condemnation. But here's what makes Stumpp's case particularly chilling from a historical perspective. His confession wasn't given freely. It was extracted under torture on the rack, that other medieval instrument of systematic pain. Hour after hour, his body was stretched and twisted until he would say anything, admit to anything, confess to crimes that defied the laws of nature itself. Under the agony of the rack, Stumpp's voice cracked as he told his interrogators exactly what they wanted to hear. He spoke of a magical belt given to him by the devil, a device that could transform him from man to wolf at will. He confessed to killing 14 children over a span of 25 years, describing each murder in detail that grew more elaborate with each session of torture. The confession became increasingly fantastical as the torture continued. Stumpp admitted to killing 2 pregnant women and consuming their unborn children. Most horrifically, he claimed to have murdered his own son and eaten the young man's brain while it was still warm. These weren't the words of a sane man making rational admissions. They were the desperate utterances of someone whose body was being systematically destroyed until he would say anything to make the pain stop. Now, here's what makes this case so significant beyond its sensational details. Stumpp's confession reflected the deepest fears and anxieties of his community. The late 16th century was a time of religious upheaval, social uncertainty, and widespread belief in supernatural threats. Werewolves, witches, and demonic possession were considered real dangers that required real responses. Stumpp became a repository for collective fears about the breakdown of social order, the corruption of family bonds, and the presence of evil in everyday life. His alleged crimes touched on every anxiety that kept communities awake at night: the safety of children, the sanctity of motherhood, the reliability of neighbors, the integrity of family relationships. The details of his supposed transformations reveal how torture-extracted confessions worked. Each session on the rack produced new details, more elaborate descriptions, additional crimes that hadn't been mentioned before. The interrogators weren't just seeking admissions of guilt, they were constructing a narrative that would satisfy both legal requirements and popular expectations. Stumpp's case also demonstrates how werewolf accusations often targeted people who were already marginalized or suspicious in their communities. While we know little about Stumpp's life before his arrest, werewolf accusations typically fell on individuals who were seen as outsiders, troublemakers, or threats to social stability. The process of extracting his confession took weeks, with regular sessions on the rack interspersed with periods of imprisonment and psychological pressure. Interrogators used a combination of physical torture, sleep deprivation, threats against family members, and religious manipulation to break down Stumpp's resistance. Contemporary accounts suggest that Stumpp initially denied all charges, maintaining his innocence even under severe torture. But human endurance has limits, and the rack was specifically designed to find and exceed those limits. Eventually, Stumpp's will broke along with his body, and the confessions began to flow. The confession sessions were carefully documented by court scribes, creating detailed records of each admission, each new detail, each elaboration of the original charges. These documents served multiple purposes: legal evidence, administrative records, and entertainment for those who would read them later. The supernatural elements of Stumpp's confession reflected contemporary beliefs about how demonic powers operated in the world. The magical belt that enabled transformation, the 25-year timeline of murders, the specific focus on children and pregnant women, all of these details aligned with popular understanding of how werewolves functioned. Stumpp's family became caught up in the expanding web of accusations. His daughter Sybil was arrested and charged with incest, based on confessions that were almost certainly extracted through torture similar to what her father endured. The Stumpp case demonstrates how werewolf and witchcraft prosecutions often consumed entire family networks. The legal machinery that processed Stumpp's case was the same system that prescribed breaking wheel executions for various crimes. His confessions, extracted through torture, created a legal justification for the most extreme punishment available under Holy Roman Empire law. Under the agony of the rack, Stumpp confessed to it all: the impossible, the demonic, the grotesque. His words, torn from him by pain, sealed his fate. The sentence was passed. The breaking wheel awaited. And on October 31st, 1589, the crowd gathered to witness an execution that would echo through the darkest corridors of history. October 31st, 1589, All Hallows' Eve. The crowd had gathered before dawn, their breath visible in the cold autumn air. Peter Stumpp stood where we first encountered him, bound to the breaking wheel, but now we understand the terrible journey that brought him to this moment. The red-hot pincers were lifted first. 10 times they tore at his flesh, each application carefully counted, precisely administered according to the court's sentence. The crowd watched in fascination as the man they believed had terrorized their community for decades received what they saw as divine justice made manifest. The executioner then moved to the wheel itself. With methodical precision, he used the blunt side of an axe to break Stumpp's limbs systematically. Each blow was calculated, designed to shatter bone while maintaining consciousness. The sounds echoed across the execution ground, the wet impact of metal on flesh, the crack of breaking bone, the gasps and cries from the crowd. When the breaking was complete, the executioner performed what was considered an act of mercy, a swift beheading that ended Stumpp's suffering. His headless body was then thrown onto a pyre, flames consuming what remained of the man who had confessed to impossible crimes under unbearable torture. But the horror wasn't finished. Sybil Stumpp, Peter's daughter, faced her own terrible fate. Accused of incest based on confessions likely extracted through torture, she was reportedly subjected to flaying before being thrown onto the same flames that consumed her father's corpse. The Stumpp family line ended in fire and agony, their very existence erased by a legal system that believed it was purging supernatural evil from the world. The crowd dispersed slowly that Halloween evening, their hunger for spectacle finally satisfied. They had witnessed what they believed was justice, the destruction of a werewolf and his corrupted offspring. But what they had actually seen was the systematic torture and execution of two human beings whose guilt existed primarily in confessions extracted through unbearable pain. Peter Stumpp's case represents the breaking wheel at its most terrible, not just as an instrument of execution, but as the culmination of a legal and social system that could transform fear and superstition into methodical brutality. His story embodies everything we've explored: the wheel's mechanical precision, its role as public spectacle, its religious justifications, and its capacity to consume not just individuals but entire families. The breaking wheel's eventual decline across Europe represented more than just changing methods of execution. It marked a fundamental shift in how societies understood justice, human dignity, and the proper limits of state power. The same communities that had once gathered eagerly to watch bodies broken on wheels gradually came to see such spectacles as barbaric relics of a darker past. This transformation didn't happen overnight or without resistance. Many argued that abandoning traditional punishments would lead to increased crime, that removing the deterrent effect of public torture would unleash chaos. But the tide of opinion was turning, influenced by Enlightenment philosophy, religious reform movements, and a growing recognition that such extreme punishments often revealed more about the brutality of the punishers than the guilt of the punished. The wheel's legacy extends far beyond its use as an execution device. It stands as a reminder of humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty, of how legal structures and religious beliefs can be twisted to justify the unjustifiable. The thousands who died on breaking wheels across Europe, the Americas, and beyond represent not just individual tragedies but collective moral failures. Yet there's also something hopeful in the wheel's eventual abandonment. Societies that had embraced these practices for centuries ultimately rejected them, recognizing that justice built on prolonged suffering was no justice at all. The movement away from public torture and toward more humane forms of punishment represents genuine moral progress, proof that human societies can learn, grow, and choose compassion over cruelty. Today, when we hear the term Catherine Wheel, we're more likely to think of fireworks than torture devices. The spinning, sparkling displays that light up our celebrations have claimed the saint's name, transforming it from an association with suffering into one with joy and wonder. Perhaps Saint Catherine herself would appreciate this transformation, her name finally bringing light instead of darkness, beauty instead of horror, celebration instead of agony. The breaking wheel reminds us that the line between civilization and barbarity is thinner than we might like to believe, and that the price of maintaining our humanity is constant vigilance against the darker impulses that can turn justice into vengeance, law into cruelty, and community celebration into collective brutality.